Bam.
Hi, my name is Richard Epstein. I'm here to talk about the Break It Down show. I don't know exactly what we're going to break it down, but I hope we don't leave it all in broken pieces.
I kind of hope he fucks shit up. Just to start off with some.
Okay, you're freezing, by the way. Pete? Pete?
Thing that satisfies. Yeah.
You froze up.
Yes. Yes. Am I disappearing?
You must have frightened yourself to death. But here I am.
On cue, my Wi-Fi is failing. Okay, there we go. I'm back. Thomas Sowell talks about the scarcity of things in economics, and then how policy people instantly forget that that's a reality, right? And that's sort of where I want to jump off, because the policy people never seem to understand how economics works. They're not good business people, and this impacts our ability to do things like reconstruction in Iraq, Afghanistan, and soon to be in Ukraine.
Well, look, I mean, I would say the following thing, because Thomas Sowell has been a colleague of mine for many years at the Hoover Institute, and he is a kind of intuitive genius who gets things right. But the interesting thing about Sowell is he got it right by thinking about it. It's not that he's ever been a businessman. In fact, he's quite the recluse in many cases when it comes to personal interaction. And I'm sort of like Sowell. To me, I've not been a businessman. I've been an academic my entire life. I've done consulting work in one thing or another. But what you try to do is to develop a series of universal first principles, which will give you a bit of modesty when you're trying to understand the world. And you started to mention scarcity, which I think is a very good place to begin. Because when you start with the notion of scarcity, the only thing it takes to have a contract or a conflict is two people. It turns out the pie is a certain size. If they conflict with one another, they can make it smaller. If they cooperate with one another, they can make it larger. And what you have to do is to get yourself in the frame of mind where you think that in order to make this relationship work, there has to be some kind of cooperation between the two of you. And it's not going to take place if you sit there with your fancy Ivy League degree, and I have too many of those, and come by and start to tell other people what reason you don't succeed is you don't do the things that I say you want to do. You didn't mention Hayek, didn't have time to, but he had another notion there, which I think is very complementary to the one about scarcity, and that's the notion of local knowledge. And it turns out that the way in which I work, and I'm a strictly cognitive kind of guy, but there are lots of people on the street who learn by the school of hard knocks, and they do it by trial and error. They work by way of repetition. And what happens is those theories do not generalize extremely well. But if you're talking in a game in which there are repetitive practices, that stuff is more reliable than anything I could bring to the table. So let me just give you a kind of an analysis of what you do when you try to consult for some kind of a business on a really big topic. The last thing you want to do when you go into the business is say, well, I've got this huge set of principles, so you listen to me. First thing you want to do is quite the opposite. Look, I don't know anything about your business. I think you ought to tell me. And then a lot of times what they try to do is to shortcut it and to say, well, this is the final conclusion of what we said. And I said, no, that's just not going to be good enough. What we have to do is to break it down into the constituent steps. And don't try to tell me what you think is relevant and rule out everything else. Tell me everything that you know within limits, and then we'll figure out the relevance later on. And so the hope is that if they give you a large enough plate full of particular details and you have a kind of a general world view about the subject matter, you get gains from trade by taking their particular knowledge and blending it with your general kind of oversight. And I think that's the way it is that everybody working overseas has to go. The problem if you come out of the sort of the Ivy League universe or you come out of these fancy foreign affairs departments and so forth, is they don't teach you methodologies to be humble. They teach you that you're the smartest people on the globe, and therefore you assume that you always have a comparative advantage over everybody else on the face of the globe, even if they have more experience, knowledge than you do in a particular area. And you can't do that. Neither theory nor experience alone is going to get you the way. What you have to do is to try to figure out the best combination between the two of them. And the only way you can do that is to actually listen to people who have these experiences before you start your general theory. Now, this is also a problem in general economic theory, because we have a view that the universal rules of cost-benefit analysis always work in certain ways. And then people on the ground will say, well, it doesn't work in that particular way in a given case. So let me give you a little example about the theory of economics on the one hand and the homey application on the other. This is told to me by a friend of mine named Dennis Carlin. He says, if you're the standard economist and you're trying to figure out how competitive markets work, what you do is you assume there's a consumer named A and there's a merchant named B, and that they're largely fungible and they interact with everybody. And I said, but that's not the way it works on the ground. So the illustration you give is you want to go to somebody in order to have them mend the dress or to bake you a wedding cake or something of the sort. And what they always tell you is, tell them that Millie sent you. And now, according to the standard economist, why would you ever want to mention Millie when you're just a different person? Well, there is a reason. Millie has been a regular customer of yours. Millie, in fact, has sent you 10 people over the various years. When you tell her you came from Millie, what happens, she says, now if I try to mess around, I'm not only going to screw up with one particular client, but this higher world is going to come over there. And so Millie becomes an implicit guarantor of her performance. And you wouldn't think of that if you thought of people as just simply initials or anonymous names. But once you get yourself into this kind of a customary environment with dense social interaction, then it turns out those particular pieces of information really start to matter. And when you start talking about high politics, if somebody says, you know, I have access to the president of the United States, and you can choose by putting him on a phone call, I mean, that just carries massive amounts of information to somebody about whether or not you are a credible person when you promise the conduct of other individuals. So we all tend to know this. And so the social situation is always one about social networks, about contacts, about ins and so forth. And what happens is you now go into a village somewhere in the middle of Afghanistan. You don't have any ins. What you have to do is to earn the trust of some people. And the only way you will earn their trust is to listen to them before you start to speak. So the advantage of being the local guy is you can get the talk first. And the advantage of being the theorist is you can understand and then reinterpret to them what they're doing. So in business, many times the following thing comes up. Some guy says, well, we've always done it this way. I said, why? I said, we're not sure. And the reason you have to know is if it's a way of assuring transformative or a transaction performance, it's an efficiency justification. If it's a way of restraining trade, it's the exact opposite. And oftentimes people don't even know why they do things. What they do is they know that it works. And you don't want to be Socrates, always kind of say, oh, you can't give a theoretical explanation, then you don't know what you're doing. What you want to be is the wiser Socrates says, well, you don't know what you're doing, but you've done it for a long time and it seems to work. Here's why. And let me explain to you this in terms of agency cost, information cost, various kinds of asymmetries. I said, well, I never thought about that. So let's get some homey advantages and put it on the table. That's the way it is, I think, you want to do work, whether you're talking about foreign affairs, ordinary business, academic consultation, advising people on their thesis. It's a fine art that you have to learn to advise people about what they do in an area where they work in it every day, and you come into it as an interloper. And if you dare disparage their particular knowledge, you're going to fail at the outset, whether you're talking with a bank on the one hand or a foreign country on the other.
This is great. One of the things that I love to point out is, so I worked in outskirts of Baghdad province. There's a place called Tuwaitha. A lot of people are familiar with this, not everybody though. And
Not
so it was
everybody.
a nuclear, yeah, it was a nuclear plant. And if you know history from a couple decades ago, you know that the Israelis came in and blew that place up because they considered it a threat.
Yeah.
If you go around Tuwaitha in the greater Baghdad province area and you say, who blew this up? The Iraqis will say, you ready for it? Iran. Now, you can say, that's absolutely lies. That's not true. It does not matter. What matters is that in the Baghdad province, and I don't know how far this truth goes out, it is absolutely Iran, and it matters, right? And so when you bring your Ivy League solution and you realize you are no way in step with reality there, you start to go, what is reality, right? Because the reality there is Iran is a serious problem for them. And there's a competition that's cultural, not reality based. And so this is like the illustration is like what you think you know. And if you don't spend time to understand, doesn't matter if you believe it or not, that is their reality. And it's like this liminality between.
Okay, now, but this is very, very important to them. Suppose they are making, in fact, a mistake, and it was the Israelis that blew it up. And they believe it was the Iranians. So they're going to want to do is prevent all their defenses looking towards the east in order to be able to control the Iranian menace. When in fact, if you're Iraqi, your menace is coming from the other side. How it is that you disabuse people of their mistakes? It's the thing about it is you cannot be preemptive or simply corrective. what you have to do is to kind of have a very long conversation about saying, well, the following, there are other people in independent countries who sort of think it was the Israelis. And I said, well, why would you think that? I said, well, now, do you know something about Israel? Well, let me start to tell you. And then what you do is you go back to the 1960s when the Israelis realized that as a small country surrounded by hostile companies, they thought they needed a nuclear deterrent to keep everybody at peace. They thought they could love to have it if they were the only ones who had it. And they thought they wanted to have it even if somebody else had it. So there's a dominant solution. You want to do that. Well, you now know that the Israelis did that. And then you give them some stuff and say, now, what are they going to do in order to control the competition? Well, I mean, in some sense, you could try to build a better bomb. But the other thing is you may try to take out the other guy's situation. And they said, well, what about Iran? And this is where you do say, look, Iran and Iraq fought a very long war from about 1980 to about 1990. And there were bloodshed and losses on both sides. And in fact, at that war, if I'm not mistaken, the Israelis were actually allied with the Iranians in this peculiar battle of inconvenience. So you say, look, now you see that kind of stuff and you're seeing these sorts of situations. Well, if the Israelis and the Iranians turn out to have some commonalities between them, it's easy for you to confuse the one with the other when it turns out after a while they start to break. And you kind of go through this a very long time. You don't do it as a monologue. You listen to other people talk. And the payoff to them is if they get it right, they will make better policy. So, take our beloved president. He wants to make sure that climate change is the greatest danger on the face of the earth. Well, you can spend $1 trillion and you'll reduce the temperature of global warming by 1/100th of a degree in 100 years. It's just a waste of resources. And so how do you then start to get people to back off of this? Well, I think you have to start very slowly and say, well, let's just figure out what have been the great changes in the world before human beings came along. This will give you something because you don't want to argue this on the assumption that when you're talking about temperatures, that in the absence of human intervention, in this case, a 25% increase in carbon dioxide levels and so forth, that the earth is a relatively stable place. And so you say, well, what happened about 10,000 years ago? And, we had a world in which Sweden was probably under 1,000 feet of ice. Now, you could start to say that human development somewhere in the Western Hemisphere, when you had people with fires, was enough to change that. But come on, give me a break. The thing that you have to understand is that the background norm is one of high variability, which extends over very long periods and extends under slow periods. Now, why does it extend under both periods? Because essentially the way in which you have to understand these various kinds of phenomena is there are multiple, and I don't know the names of these things, but it really doesn't matter. There are multiple facts that go on different kinds of cycles. And it turns out the world either cycles or it spins out of control. And sort of if you look at any kind of serious phenomenon, it looks like a sine wave, something going up and something going down. But you get many of these curves, and when they're piled upon one another, you have to take at any given point the first curve and then add to it the influence of the second curve. And some point, the two of them will cancel out so that you'll have a relatively stable environment. But since their cycles are not the same, sometimes they basically reinforce one another and drive you to some kind of an extreme. So that's a very simple model that you could start to put together, which starts to explain how natural variation can lead to the kinds of extremes that you had. But if you then go just a little bit further, these things which are now perfectly aligned will be out of alignment because the cycles are different. Well, I gather in the global warming stuff, there are 3 or 4 different cycles that operate on very different lengths at very different times. So until you control for the natural variables, you can sort of assume that everything is going to happen because what it is that we want to do. Then you want to look at the recent time. One of the things you should tell everybody to do is look at the situation, the temperature graphs that are put out by the University of Alabama at Huntington, I think it is. It's a sort of standard source about temperatures. And what do you notice? Well, what you notice is, for example, in 1998, you may remember this, I certainly remember, it got bloody hot. Yeah. And in fact, there I was sitting in New York, and in Chicago, I can still remember the day when the hot thing just broke. It went all the way through late August, and it just disappeared as if it had gone out. And the same thing happened in 2016. The key to understanding what's going on is to ask what happened in 2015 and 2017. And what happened in 1997 and 1999. And what happens is you see a sharp run up and a sharp decline, a sharp run up and a sharp decline. And you can't explain those local variations by pointing to carbon dioxide levels, which in the short period don't move very much at all. So what you have to do is to assume that there's some other more powerful forces at work. Even if you can't identify them, you know that they have to be in operation. And so if they're in operation, then you have to demote the level of significance that you attach to carbon dioxide level and try to do it. So, I mean, it's always a very, very difficult effort on how to do these things. But what happens is every time you have a sine curve and it goes up, the world is coming to an end. Every time the curve starts to go down, you just ignore what has happened and wait for the next up. And so it just moves all in one kind of direction. Now, this is a really expensive stuff. My friend Ben Zeiger always quotes the numbers. Take the government's own figures and ask what is going to happen in the global warming arena if we do everything that they want, whether it's with electron cars or whatever it is. And it turns out you can't get more than 1/10 of a degree of change on anything. Now, how much is that? Well, there's a very interesting study on agriculture. What you do is you ask what kind of grain do you pass at what kind of latitude, right? This is the adaptive response. And basically, if you go in the United States and you start, say, somewhere in the middle of Mississippi, and you go up to the middle of Minnesota, and you have different growing seasons, different temperatures, and so forth, you have remarkably constant yields. Now, why is that? Well, it's not because you're planting the same seed in all of these places, but what it is, you manage to do selective breeding on the seed so that what you could do is to get the right seed in the right location and vastly increase yield. Well, now, if it turns out that you change the temperature so that as you start to go north, things get a little bit hotter, you could assume that the old wheat is not going to grow, so you're substituting the new wheat for it, and you have to take into account the mitigation strategy before you start to figure out the aggregate losses. Now, how much of this is going to depend on what? You can't know. I mean, but you really have to look. And so the first thing you say about global warming is before you leap to carbon dioxide as the explanation of everything, when you have these relatively minor changes, what you try to do is to look for other kinds of factors that can influence this stuff at a more violent level, and that those things are going to be much more important in trying to figure out these disruptions. La Nina and El Nino. Now, to give you just another example of that, I'm going to mention 3 points in time, all involving Houston. You go back and you look at 1935, and you see the city flooding, and it goes absolutely bananas. But carbon dioxide levels there were under 300, right? So it's not driving that explanation. Then you come to a couple of years ago, and you have 2 storms that hit Houston, one of which stays there because a high pressure zone is coming down from the north, and it floods the place out. And the next one comes along, and it just goes passing right through because it doesn't meet with this kind of resistance. Well, you look at this stuff, climate change, carbon dioxide. No, you have to find an explanation that's going to explain what takes on in a 2-week cycle. And the high level pressure zone is a much more powerful explanation of that than other kinds of changes. So you just must do this. And what always happens is a kind of a legal version of this. They're the lumpers and the splitters. The lumpers always said, bad weather has caused harm. And the splitters always come along and they say, let's take this term down and figure out what particular kind of phenomenon you're wanting to talk about. Tell us what the bad weather is. Tell us what its anticipated effects is, and rule out other causes for the same thing. And it turns out intellectually, I'm a splitter. I mean, every time you try to put all of this stuff together in one big bag and say X causes Y, I'm sitting down there and saying, it can't be right. You have to find something. So this is a methodological point, right? But it applies to foreign affairs and it applies to global warming. Your epistemology really matters in the way in which you start to shape these various kinds of activities.
When you look at something like Ukraine, one of the things I noticed is, and this will go back to your legal mind too. I dealt with a lot of things with rule of law, and they'll say rule of law has to improve, and I'm like, but they have rule of law. You may not like it. It may not look like what happens at Georgetown or Harvard, but they deal with murder here. They deal in civil court, and I'm saying civil court so you understand what I'm saying. But they sit down. They have holy men there. They get into an argument. Everybody waves their hands, and then they all of a sudden have. I can't explain it. But I'm telling you, that kid murdered somebody, all the families dealt with it, and it's over, and they have some kind of agreement. And so you may not call that rule of law, but it is. And then when we look at their court system that we try to implement on them, and I'm going to get to Ukraine here in a second, when we implement their court system on them, and then they ask me, hey, Pete, it's the Americans, hey, Pete, find out why that judge won't go out and get cases. And why isn't he doing his job? So I do. I go out and I talk to him, and I'm like, hey, man, the Americans want to know, why you won't go get cases. And the judge looks at me and says, I don't know how courts work in America, but here, judges don't go get cases. They're brought before him. By the way, I don't have furniture yet. You guys haven't done your job. And I don't know why they won't bring me cases. Maybe you go find that out. I'm like, this is great. A second tasking. So I go out and I go to the chief of police for the state, the province.
Yeah.
And there's a whole line of dads all lined up. And I'm like, I see what's going on here. It's an informal, formal version of rule of law. And you talk to these dads kind of intermittently, and they're all there because their kids are idiots, just like all sons are. And we talked to the chief of police later on. He's like, what's that?
Speak for yourself.
Exactly. Yeah. And so we talked to chief of police later on. He's like, yeah, man, all these guys are dumb. They're kids, but we don't need them to go to court and go to jail. We just need to deal with this in the least punitive way possible. And so that's their rule of law. They don't want to do the court system. They don't want kids going to jail. They don't want to use the crime. And so they don't want our solution. So when we go to a place like Ukraine, we look at them and we want them to be modern America. We don't want them to be wherever they are in the timeline in terms of economic development, legal development, all these things. We say they're corrupt. I would say we're the corrupting force, but you have all of these captains of industry and where they're at. It might be 120 years ago for us in many parts of their development. In some ways they're very modern, in other ways they're not. And so we can look at the collapse of the Soviet Union happening 35 years ago and say, they ought to be here where we are now. They should have women's rights and gay rights. Give them a minute to develop economically in all these different ways. But we struggle with that, especially if we're, East Coast Ivy League degree people who are going overseas and trying to solve these things. How am I doing?
Well, you're doing okay, but I think you misunderstand the American system.
Okay.
The American system has at its top a series of courts that use formal adjudication with judges and parties making pleadings with coercive solutions. But if you actually look at solutions on the ground, they're handled very much more like they are in these tribal companies. People are genuinely uneasy about going to court. The expense is very high. The public exposure is going to be very, very great. The possibility of error is not trivial because in that kind of forum, you don't know whom you're going to get for a jury or a trial. And so what most people prefer to do is they prefer to sit down with somebody else who they know and they trust and then have a system of informal mediation to try to resolve these things. It turns out if there's this close community that's around, what you see is there are a bunch of other people who are spectators to this, who know the families, the parties, and so forth involved. And the effective sanction that you have, if there is a judgment which is widely perceived as correct, is that if you flout it, you're not only going to alienate the party on the opposite side of the case, but you're going to alienate everybody else who's an onlooker in the community. When Jonathan Haidt did his studies on sort of informal adjudication, what he said, in effect, is that when you watch various kinds of disputes, gossip is an incredibly powerful form of social distinction. You get large numbers of people talking together. There's nobody who has a dominant position. And so it's kind of distributed across the group. And when they come to a kind of consensus of what's going on, it's going to have an extremely high level of legitimacy because the people who name it will make it. So what you see in the United States in many areas is exactly this. And sometimes it gets very large. Many years ago, one of my colleagues at Chicago, Lisa Bernstein, did a study on how the diamond industry worked. It's a classic paper, 1993 Journal of Legal Studies. And it turned out when it was exclusively within the Hasidim community and so forth, they all had their stalls next to one another. They used to argue one way or another. But virtually all of the disputes when they came up, whether technical or not, were resolved in this informal matter before a bunch of people who were at the thing. Now, it turns out, suppose now what the industry does is it fragments, and they're not all in the same community. You get Japanese dealers who come in, a Jewish American dealer, somebody from Latin America, whatever. At that particular point, everybody realizes that the informal mode of adjudication won't work because you don't have the elders of a common community coming in there to observe. And so at that point, what you have to do is you have to have much more formal mechanisms to resolve it. But it comes at a cost. If you are doing this in the local way, you could resolve disputes under, say, $10,000 relatively expeditiously. If you are working on this other system, okay, then what you have to do is you have to have a much larger level of dispute in order to make sure that you could justify bringing everything else into the way in which this starts to go. And so what you do is you get this two-tier system. And over again, one of the things that you discover is that if you interview or introduce a very strong government oversight profession, what you do is you drive out the informal mechanisms that would otherwise be used, and that in effect leads to inferior decision making in the United States in the way it does other ways. So what you're talking about the other guys, I think you got that right. But I think you kind of over systemized, simplified the American system by sort of saying that it runs that way. I mean, I'm just trying to think of how many contractual disputes I've had in my life, with publishers, with authors, with students, and so forth. And, if I actually started to count, it would be a non-trivial number. And then when I started, I said, what's the number of times I've actually gone to court? Thank God, it's a very round number. It was actually one case, I think, that I had that did this, and I think everybody handled it wrong. This was some 50 years ago, and I learned a lot about a litigation. But in general, what you are is, if you can trust the people in your general environment to do things, then you could do it. So, I mean, there was recently a dispute we had about our house with some provider, and I didn't take over the dispute. I'm merely a law professor, right? But somebody who worked in the trade, they started to talk it out, and magically, all of a sudden, there seemed to be a solution. And then I realized what my appropriate role was. Shut up. I'm not the person who knows. I'm not working in this trade all the time. I don't put in 1,000 orders for furniture or for fixtures or whatever it is. Everybody else in this business starts to do. So, that kind of humility. When I wrote a paper many years ago called In Defense of the Contract at Will, your first thing said, what the guy is this talking about? Well, a contract at will means in an ordinary two-party arrangement, say employment is the most common one. You can hire or fire for good reason, bad reason, and no reason at all. And so when you call something a permanent contract of employment, you mean that you could be gone the next day. You could either quit or you could be fired. And what happens is there was a widespread part of belief on the part of learned academics that you don't want to have this kind of arrangement because it gives rise to caprice and arbitrariness. And so they wanted to start introducing various kinds of four-clause rules which would limit this. And what happens is it turns out they just don't work and they have to be abandoned. What counts as a cause is infinitely various. And in many cases, there are all sorts of disputes about facts one way or another. If you start looking at these kinds of contracts, you discover two things about them. One is that many of them last for a very long period of time with informal adjustments because the people have specific capital that is related only to the others. And secondly, when it turns out that you have major external changes in the way in which the world works, a contract at will lets you to get out of these difficult arrangements without having to go to court. And so if you start looking what happened during the COVID situation, right, what you saw is this incredible turnover in the way in which this labor worked, moving back and forth across markets. There were some people, one of my colleagues, Eric Posner, had the misguided view of seeing that there's some kind of an employer monopoly in these kinds of markets, but you don't even know what the market is. So one of the things I did when thinking about this is I sort of looked at 100 people whom I knew, and I asked them what business did they leave and what business did they go to. And, they went all over the lot. So I was teaching English. Now I'm a graphic designer and things like that. What happens is people pursue their own individual things. And the importance of a contract at will is it allows the market to re-equilibrate much more rapidly than it does if you happen to have an explanation as to why you fire, or God forbid, why it is that you want to quit a job. And so I did this thing in 1984, pretty much alone in the academic community. And then you started to watch. And whenever people tried to, as it were, make these things for cause contracts legally, what they discovered is fierce resistance. Employers wouldn't take it. Even employers became unhappy about it. But on the other hand, if you have a decent job and somebody fires you arbitrarily and there's a for-cause claim that you could make, presenting it informally usually gets the job done. And doesn't do it in every case, but you're not trying to say a system is unsound if it has a single absolute failure. The correct test in all of these situations, what's the relative frequency of failures? And so if you're running a system with a very high rate of performance, don't change it because you find a case which seems to defy the odds. Leave it like it is, and then fix that case independently of trying to create a palace revolution with respect to everything else.
I guess this takes us over to the, we use the word oligarch a lot. And what I've
that's me.
learned.
Academic
What's
oligarch.
that?
I'm an academic oligarch.
Yeah. We see this, though, it's used in a derogatory sense, but you also could say these are captains of industry. You can just say they're businessmen, and they've come up through the all the
Right.
Soviet Union. And so how do we determine? Look, I know from my Intel background, once you get labeled as a bad person, we just don't ever want to change that. We don't want to allow for
Mhm.
rehabilitation. We don't want to allow for our own mistake of who you are. We have these people that are industrialists that have extremely complex relationship networks. They know how to work incredibly complex machines, whether they're extracting titanium and turning it into an entire industry of titanium products. We are desperate to throw these people away. So who replaces them? And you talked about the recovery of an economy, kind of if you just get out of their way. How do we help ourselves and pick the right people, or shut up and get out of the way and allow folks who know how to do these things? How do we get that right? Because we seem to
Yeah.
get this wrong a lot.
We do seem to get it wrong. And a lot of it is the question of how it is that people come by their wealth is a kind of a question. And
Right.
if you sort of come by and you invent a patent and start to put together a bunch of businesses in one forth or another, generally the assumption is that you made it by moxie and intelligence, and that you could not get to that particular position if what you did was to stiff your customers and to cheat your employee. And so, you start looking at the benefits that come from the 19th century robber barons and so forth. And you just kind of ask the following question: well, how much did it cost to ship a ton of goods from Topeka, Kansas to New York City in 1850? And how much did it cost to do that in 1900? And you
Right.
discover that these guys get fabulously rich by lowering the prices to everybody else by a very large amount. And then the question is why? Well, if it's a restricted trade practice, these prices are going to go higher and quantities are going to go lower. What it is these guys bring immense kinds of efficiencies by organizing people into novel forms, which they never had before, and manage to keep this dance going. And some of them are extremely clever about switching images. So Commodore Vanderbilt of Vanderbilt University, right? He starts on the waters and he says, this is not going to work. And then all of a sudden he becomes a railroad guy, right? Well, that takes a tremendous amount of skill to do that. You try to figure out what John D. Rockefeller did. Well, he probably did a little bit of rough stuff here and there. But the question you want to ask is, did he figure out ways to organize the refinery process, the extraction process, the transportation process into a firm? And that's probably something which is going to be more important than the other sort of thing. Now you start looking at somebody like, say, Carlos Slim. And this guy's very rich too. Anybody who gets an exclusive grant by way of a government grant, right, in the privatization of industry is instantly suspect. Because what happens is, what you know is that the state had an exclusive monopoly, and it turns out you're a friend of the guy who runs it. And if this guy now decides to give it to you in exchange for the boost that you will give to that person in keeping the power, you really ought to be very, very, very suspicious. So how you come by your wealth should matter an enormous amount in the way in which these things go. But essentially what happens is, in the good Marxist situation, somebody whose business excellence is treated as the same thing as a common theft. And look, where do we get that from? Well, you've heard about the phrase wage exploitation, right? And you ask yourself, well, what does it mean? It means
Yeah.
you're entering into a contract with a boss, and the boss is exploiting you in the strongest form by giving you an offer that leaves you worse off than you would have been if you had not taken the deal at all. So the question is, like, why would you take it? Even if you have no market power whatsoever, why are you going to take? Well, that clearly doesn't kind of work as an explanation, because we have people who take a job. It turns out it's a crappy job. And you know what happens? They quit within 2 days and so forth, and they go somewhere else and they tell their friend. And so the guys who play those kinds of games lose in the reputational market, which is much more powerful than the legal market, because it's to take one word to do it, and it's instantaneous in its effect, and it doesn't depend upon formal judgment. So we know if your name is Bon Vivant and you make a poison form of Vichy Soir, you're out of business in 2 weeks, not because of the product liability suits, but because nobody will touch your product. We know if you're an airline and you have a crash that's unexplained, you're going to lose much more in terms of customer loyalties than you're going to lose in terms of judgments that take place. So this reputational market, which is always poo-pooed by people like Ralph Nader and so forth, is a much more powerful market. And everybody who's in business, they know they have the following situation. You have to set up the brand in order to attract people and to establish your loyalty. And then you have to protect your brand. And the way in which you have to protect that particular brand is to make sure that if anything goes wrong, you're on top of it before anybody else is on top of it. So if you remember the case, I think it was Johnson & Johnson, but it really doesn't matter. If somebody is selling this kind of product, and then what you do is you see they have syringes in the middle of these kinds of bottles, right? Or poisons that get in. Well, the first thing you do is you clear the shelves. Everybody does. You don't wait for the FDA to tell you anything or
Right.
anybody else. Often, why is that? Because you're talking about $100 million worth of good and a reputation worth $10 billion, right? The
Right.
ratios are very clear. You just get it off. Then what you do is you have to explain to people how it happened. And the explanations that don't work particularly well is where we were slovenly in the way in which we ran our production plant. The way it really works is what happened. You could prove that somebody took one of these products and then tampered with it, put some syringe in there, put it back on the shelves, and then pretended that it was you that did it. Now, can you guard against that? Well, you can't. Now, how do you find a way to do it? Well, one of the things that you start to do is you have to have what we call, chain of control, chain of custody control. Very rigorous. This is true with elections, right? Think of Mr. Trump in the current situation. How did it happen in Atlanta, whatever it is? But with businesses, it's the same. So what businesses do is they put a bunch of little numbers on everything, right? And you just look at this as kind of like, who cares? Well, what the numbers do is they indicate in digit number 1 where this thing was made, digit number 2 how it was shipped, digit number 3 the retailer to which it went, right? And then what you do when you have multiple failures, you look at the digit codes. And if it turns out these things at the one retailer were all manufactured at 6 different plants, and they're all occurring here, it's a downstream issue rather than an upstream issue. And once you know it's a downstream issue, you can say, well, is it a dealer doing something wrong? Or is it a consumer, deviant, who's doing the thing? And then you say, well, it's probably the latter. Then you turn on the cameras and you start to see who took what. And sure enough, in the case I mentioned, there was a guy who was caught on a camera near the vending machines, basically substituting in bad things. Well, you do that, all of a sudden your brand is going to be much more protected. A, you didn't do anything that was systematically wrong.
Yeah.
And B, you took everything off the product. And C, you found the culprit, right? And if you don't do this sort of stuff, you're going to be lost. Well, I mean, I've seen this. I used to work for the tobacco companies, okay? And try to organize their defenses. I'm a vehement anti-smoker. I never touched the stuff. I didn't touch it then. But you certainly could see what was going on. And I could still remember the way in which they thought about their product. What is the definition of a defect in a product? Sounds a little bit exotic, right? Mm-hmm. Well, if you look at anybody, they think of it as a defect is you got some poisonous gas that was injected there, or you got the remains of a dead snail or something like that. And so what the companies say is if anything like that happens, gone, as I mentioned before, for the reasons stated. But the new definition of a defect is a cigarette has menthol, it has nicotine, it has tar, right? Well, at that point, every cigarette is defective rather than just some. And so now you have an industry battle. And it seems to me the correct question is this a state secret that nobody knows except the manufacturer? Or is it common knowledge on the part of consumers? And if it's common knowledge, then what they do is they either know enough to decide whether or not to smoke, or they know enough to ask somebody else whether or not they ought to smoke. And then you start looking at the industry, and what do you see? There is 2 things happening as the information comes out. One is the percentage of people who buy cigarettes starts to go down because it turns out the collateral effects are now identified. And then 2, it turns out the mix of cigarettes that are sold starts to change. So when I was a 7-year-old boy and I watched people smoke, it was Camels, it was Old Gold, it was Pall Mall. That stuff was really heavy. And by the time you moved on, it was all these filtered, cool, mentholated cigarettes and so forth. So you managed to gain health 2 ways. You had fewer smokers, and it turns out that they were smoking less dangerous stuff. And all you needed to do is to let this process run itself along. And you didn't have to have all the particular lawsuits, which had the following very bad effect. If I know that if I smoke something, I know it's dangerous and I get sick, hey, I can now sue the tobacco company. I managed to get a warranty. And that warranty will induce a higher level of smoking than otherwise is the case. So, I mean, information really is something that you want. Reputation is something that you want. And it goes back to the point that you have. You look at anybody who's a fancy guy from Harvard or Yale and so forth. And what they all do is they say, well, we know so much that we should control it. These decentralized devices like reputation really don't matter. And so therefore, we ought not to rely upon them. And you take this with automobile safety, it's the same thing. You'd have thought that cars were getting more and more dangerous right before the stuff came in. But in fact, when do you think the greatest improvements in automobiles took place? Do you know?
I mean, it's been a long time since they put safety glass in windows, so I would think.
That was in the 30s, right?
Yeah,
There was
yeah.
a famous case called Baxter, which involved that as a device. But what happened is, if you actually look at the charts, there's it's pretty dangerous stuff. It's a first dip in the 20s when you kind of get these technologies working. But after the Second World War, you have all the transformation of military technology into the civilian side.
Oh, yeah,
one.
sure.
And you take all these cars that were 6 years old and still on the road breaking down, and you replace them with a shiny new 1947 Pontiac car, right? And so that's when you had the major drops starting to take place. It had nothing to do with government regulation. In fact, one of the things I like to do sometimes is you just take a curve, show the ups and downs. You don't put years on it anywhere, right? And then you ask somebody, could you actually figure out where the calendar would go along these lines? And then when you know, can you figure out what the explanation is?
I love it. I love it.
Well, it's very important when you do this with automobile safety. Very important to do it with cigarettes. Very important to do it with surgeries and so forth. The safety in the United States today, through decentralized processes that we don't even understand fully, are probably down. All these risks are down by probably 90% since 25 to 30 years ago. You want a risk of surgery? I mean, you're not quite as old as I am, so you don't remember what it's like in the early 1950s, do you?
No.
But
I was born in '70, so I'm getting there, but I'm not that old.
No. The point is, we're modern. I was raised in a period in a medical family of therapeutic nihilism, and what happened is somebody, you had to go in even for a tonsillitis and so forth. That you're going under surgery. The background risk was just very large, and everybody was very nervous about it.
Yeah.
What happens is the surgeries are more difficult, but the background risks are much more under control. It's a combination of more precise tools, better instrumentation, medical imaging of one form or another is so much better than it's ever been. And so if you start looking at the rates, what happens is the medical malpractice crisis, which sort of hit in the mid-'70s in a big kind of way. And I just started teaching at that time and was talking about it and so forth. Well, it's not so big. Now, why is that? It's not because the verdicts have gotten smaller. It's because the frequency of adverse events that can be attributable to physicians gets much smaller. And so you don't get it. So one of my friends who's a very well-known hospital president, I asked him why it is that the Obamacare debate didn't feature medical malpractice as one of its major issues, because you had all these surgeons starting to talk about it. Well, it turns out they were talking about it a lot more 20 years before, when it was very much more a live issue than it was in 2010. But the other thing was, you can now quantify the risk. And the way he said, I'm not going to sit there when a bed may take in $2,000 a bed for the day with everything, and worry about $50 per bed per day, which is what the malpractice premium is. It's now 2% of the total. What am I going to do? Cut it by half?
Right.
And what is it going to do to my bottom line? Very little. On the other hand, when you start looking at big cases, oftentimes they're of the most prosaic cause. You take out the wrong kidney. At that point, what do? Well, you just find a malpractice firm to defend you, and you start putting 6 or 7 figures on the table because you know you're wrong. And so the whole situation starts to change, because if you go to a doctor, just ask the following question. How many times do they ask you before you go into the surgery to state your name?
Right. Yeah. I mean, even before I weigh in, I've been asked twice. Right. So let's go back to the Ukraine thing. And then so we have these people who are businessmen, right? And we get these negative perceptions. And you talked about the whole like risk on brand. A lot of what I see is there's a desire to carve up Ukraine because it is so nutrient rich and there's so much money there. So the adversarial thing. The other day this is 100% true. I was sitting on Roger Clinton's couch. And I was like, we were talking about risk and these kinds of things. And I'm like, someone can just make a girl show up at a party from 30 years ago and she can say whatever she wants. And you're going to be like, I don't know, man, I threw a lot of parties. I'm trying to do my Roger Clinton. And he's like, that happened to me, and because of my brother, people come after me in weird ways. And so your adversary, business wise, can invest in various things and they can put out stories. I mean, we love to hate a billionaire, right? And so it's like, if we can angle this person out, we can carve out a real sweet payday for us. So if there is, I don't want to say nefarious because that's a little more dangerous, but if you have an adversary that comes after you in terms of reputation, and you're a business person, not a PR person, you're not worried about brand, you're just worried about like, I'm an industrialist, right? we, again, as we're trying to fix Ukraine post this Russian war, we don't understand, one, the reputation network that has to include Russians in all the stands and all these other areas.
Yep.
How do we deal with that? How do we improve our accuracy so we don't get, we got fooled all the time in Iraq. We settled scores left and right. We killed people. I'm an intel guy. I promise you, I'm responsible for people dying because I believe this guy over that guy, you know? So how do we improve our ability to make sure we keep the right people in charge and don't believe we love to hate a billionaire, man. We just love it.
Okay, well, first of all, what you have to do is to explain to people that wealth is a two-edged sword. My late friend, Fred McChesney, always used to talk about milker bills. He said, what the hell is a milker bill, right? He said, well, the standard view you have is large industry groups dominate small people. And what they do is they manage to get huge preferences for themselves through the system of regulation, which is why we prefer markets. That was the theory that was developed by George Stigler in a paper called The Theory of Regulation back in 1971. And it was this sort of industry dominate. And the earlier version of this was by Nick Calco saying, you know, we put the Interstate Commerce Commission in place. And why did we do that? Because we were trying to make sure that the railroads could control all of that stuff. So in fact, it was a cartel protecting device rather than a rate reduction device. And there was a lot of truth of that, particularly in the early periods. But George was wrong. By the time you start getting later, the dynamic could work in two directions, depending on the politics. The big guy can take over the situation and force everybody to decide. But the little guy can be like a wasp stinging an elephant, right? And what happens is he comes after you, and you're too small for him to swat you down. Your reputation is much bigger than his. So if he manages to land a blow on you, it can cost you millions of dollars. If you land a blow on him, he ends up blowing you. You were anonymous beforehand, you're anonymous afterwards. And if in fact he makes you more famous by showing that you're a guy, you may get somebody else say, hey, this is the kind of man I can hire, and then do it again. So what happens is Fred managed to introduce the notion that size was both an advantage on the one hand and a disadvantage on the other hand. And once you realize that the second part of that is there, then what it should do is it force you to say, let's just slow down before we make these kinds of judgments, black hats and white hats. And indeed, the way in which I like to put it is if there are people in an industry who have reputational losses because of customers on the one hand or suppliers on the other, they're more likely to be telling the truth than the guy who has no such connection. So when I was a law student and so forth, I was also trying to work in the legal aid committee. This was not my natural stuff. And I could still remember the first case I got from somebody who came in and she said she was treated very badly by the merchant and wanted to get some kind of relief. So I did the really terrible thing. I actually called up the merchant to find out what happened. And instead of hearing this sort of general denial, well, what this did is he spent 15 minutes on the phone with me explaining, well, she came in, she said that, but it was wrong. We tried to make this accommodation. It didn't work. And then by the time this thing was done, I asked myself, why am I doing this? I couldn't figure out an explanation because it seemed to me after I heard both sides of the story that this guy was right. Now, why is it that he's got an incentive to be right? He's got a lot of customers. And if these stories are credible and they're taken away, he's going to be in trouble. So it's the same sort of thing. And you start talking to people in business and so forth. You know the old maxim, the customer's always right.
Yeah.
Well, nobody believes that, right? But the question is, why do you say it?
Right.
Because what you do is you tend to say that if I don't settle cases that are a little bit iffy, I'm going to lose much more than the customer is. And so what I do is I give a little bit more. Well, how much more? Well, you're now a company, and what you do is you have customers. Say you're in the telephone business. What happens is every time somebody calls up with a complaint, they get somebody else as an agent, right? And so that there's no memory if you just simply rely on talk. So what you are supposed to do as a business is every time you get a call, when it's done, you wrote down who called, what they said, and put it in a log. So it's like a registry. And so now when the next guy picks up the case with the same client, they start to look. And what you discover is something which we will call Epstein's law, although it is not, which is sort of like 98% of your complaints come from 2% of your people. Right? And so what's this thing? You got these chronic characters, and they're always trying to play the game. And so what you have to do at some point is to say to them, look, I mean, we've tried to honor you. We'll give you a farewell settlement. You know, here's $20 that you don't deserve or whatever it is, and we're getting rid of you as a customer. And those kinds of devices actually seem to work. We discovered today, in general, and this is not my situation, in a world of contracts at will, you tend to have very little formal record keeping that takes place because you don't have to have a good reason to get rid of somebody legally. But typically you won't do it socially unless there's a reason for you to do it. So kind of self-correcting medicine. But when you have the modern laws, you can fire somebody on the basis of race, sex, age, sexual orientation, union membership, right, weight, whatever it is. All of a sudden, you now have good grounds and bad grounds for dismissal of people. And so what businesses have to do is to give up flexibility and to basically now keep elaborate logs of everything that goes on with respect to every company and what to do. And in fact, they do that. And if you start looking at the way the cases go, they're down because this record stuff is very decisive and the defendants will start to win. There is a kind of a general law. Whenever you introduce a new field with a radical transformation, the business guys are slow to pick it up. The plaintiff's lawyers are much more enterprising and they get there very fast. But the moment you get hit 2 and 3 times, the CEO comes along and says, we're looking at these product liability cases. We used to give it to the guy who defended intersection collision. What does he know about the way transmissions are put together? Which engineers can he get to it? So you go to a major law firm and say, start me a product liability department, which will do automotive defense. And they start to put it together. And all of a sudden, cases got $7 million against somebody who didn't know what he was doing. And now get $100,000 against somebody else who starts to do it. So what happens is private enterprise develops a series of shield techniques to deal with these kinds of things. But it won't work if you got yourself a truly terrible case. And by the way, now you have another risk. With generic products, it will not work if it turns out that you get judges and juries that have it in for somebody. So, you can't buy talcum powder in the United States anymore. You can buy it everywhere else in the world. And that's because it turns out plaintiffs' lawyers persuaded some jury somewhere that this stuff caused cancer. Here, you start looking at the FDA. Now, the FDA has 2 kinds of basic function. One is they do a terrible job in keeping new therapies off the market because they tend to stress the downside, not the benefits. But on the other hand, when it starts to come to these stuff, they're actually pretty good when it comes to not taking off the market those products which actually seem to have a proven safety record. And so what they do is they start to defend you. And the way in which that works, it should be, in my mind, quite decisive. The FDA is not known as essentially a product guy only. They, some cases are, some cases they aren't. You want to say that should kind of count pretty heavily in a case like this. Now, the problem is there's another problem in American industry which hurts everybody. And this is to what extent are the technical people protected by the politicians? And to what extent are the technical people used by the politicians? And in my life, starting in the 1960s, when I first got into this business to today, there's been a real shift for the worst, which is the political guys used to think their job was to let the technicians do their work. And so they would protect them. Now they say, well, we want to go after somebody, so you give me this kind of a record. And you start looking at the findings of the CDC and the FDA on the various vaccines, right? There are literally thousands of reports out there of adverse effects of one kind or another by informal collective means. You look at the CDC, they don't have anything. You look at Mr. Fauci, he says, well, everybody knows this thing came from a wild strain, baloney. And now, people say, well, it's got to have been from a laboratory. And, the papers that he published are now under challenges for academic fraud before the institution. But the institution's a journal, which essentially is in league with Mr. Fauci. So they won't get that. They're going to go to court. Anybody can guess. That is, we do know in the United States today, it's no secret that there is a very vast difference between a Democratic judge and a Republican judge, right? Yeah. I mean, just huge. I mean, it's not as though, as in the olden days, it was very difficult to tell who was what. But the polarization that exists in the political world exerts a heavy influence in the confirmation process. And so you get a lot of 52-48 confirmations on both directions, tends to put a bifurcation. So getting the right judge now really matters in a way which it never did before. And the same thing when it starts coming to appellate panels. And it's one thing to have a very novel case. So to give you an idea of how law has moved, back in the 20s and 30s, you'd have a very interesting case on which everybody would write commentary. There was a passenger trying to get on an airplane, rather on a train. He was carrying a package which concealed explosives, and the conductor didn't know whether to push him on or to pull him off, and the package fell out and exploded and damaged somebody else. Can you hold the railroad responsible when it doesn't know the contents of the practice? And you just could give endless arguments on both sides. Now, how often is that going to happen?
Yeah, not very often.
Once in a blue moon, right?
Yeah.
Because the guy who's carrying the package could kill himself. The first thing that's going to happen. So now the question is whether or not cigarettes are defective, right? Or whether vaccines are defective. You're talking about things that are consumed or applied to millions upon millions of people. And if it turns out that you get the wrong answer on that, it only takes a 1% failure rate for a vaccine when you've given it to 100 million people, right, to get yourself into a million possible cases in the court system. So it's just completely changed. And, since you don't have any confidence in the independence of these people, what you see is a real sort of deep disagreements on both sides of the question. I don't want to give you my preferences on any of these issues and so forth, but I will say, I guess this is the last point I have time for, is when I started to become a torts lawyer, the big case in my life, it was a very interesting case, is there was a cricket ball that was hit out of the park by a batsman who in 1 in a million years bopped a lady on the head. And the question is whether or not she could recover for being hit by the cricket ball, which the House of the Lords ultimately said no for all the wrong reasons, right? Well, that's like the explosive case. We don't care about cricket balls institutionally, right? But if the question is, what are we going to do with a vaccine, if it's good or whether it's bad and so forth, you're talking about millions of cases. And here the political stuff becomes much more powerful than it is in these other kinds of cases. So what you do is you have a massive level of institutional instability, which is aggravated in the political regime with 5149 confirmations and so forth, and aggravated through the administrative law system, aggravated by executive orders that could become unilateral by a president. So we have developed, in the worst sense, this very highly divisive and polarized economy, and the key features associated with it are essentially a lack of trust. I've lost you, but that's, I guess, the final thing I have to say. A lack of trust leads to all sorts of problems. Hello?
I got kicked out of my own show.
Well, I just ended on the following note saying, when you get that kind of division, you get a lack of trust. And when you get a lack of trust, all the informal mechanisms for compromise can no longer start to work. So it's back to the theme that we started with. Well, anyhow, I guess it's time for me to go from your show, but thank you for having me.
I got to say one thing to you before I go, because this is kind of funny. My buddy Jeff said, sorry for never attending antitrust class back in the spring quarter of 2008. I had to send that to you.
Oh, that was me.
Yeah. He was, his name's Jeff Blahar, and he had your class, I guess, in the spring of 2008. He's like, I never went to that class. Tell him I'm sorry.
Well, he missed a lot. There was a number of students there who became major antitrust players.
See, he didn't know. Anyhow, I appreciate you coming on. And just it's a great chat, and I'd love to have you back on sometime. And I appreciate you hanging out with me. So
great.
Have a great time. I'm going to run the credits. You don't got to hang out anymore. I'll follow up and we'll do it again.
Okay. Take care, Pete. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Happy to talk.
Yeah.
Now, how do I get
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you.